Hey, everybody, welcome to the Fractured Faith podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hopping. And for those of you watching on YouTube, you will see me live. I'm going to experiment a little bit with videos. We did last time with our guest, Dr. Lopez, Nacho, for those who watched or listened to that one. And you know what? He's encouraging me to try out a video and kind of see how it is. So I want to try that out, see kind of how I feel about it. For those on Spotify or on Apple Podcast, you'll still get the same audio as you would be. You just don't get the video. If you do video, you see my book nook in the back and some guitars that I kind of play around with a little bit. Nothing too much, but it's always fun with all the books and craziness going on there. Well, with that, I actually want to introduce today's topic. I really want to talk about the Bible canon. Okay, this is not canon. It's not a weapon that we're going to shoot, from a ship or something like that. But we're talking about the biblical canon. Canon being the set standard of what books are in the Bible. There's like I think 66 books in the Bible, and like why are those books in there when we open it up? And a lot of times we take it for granted when we open up an English Bible. You see the Old Testament, you see the New Testament, you see the writings on there. You know, for years as a kid, you memorize them: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. You get the Pauline epistles, all these letters that are all in there. But they're all in that Bible, and we talk about the scriptures or the Bible. And a lot of times we talk about it in the sense that it's kind of always been there. It's always just something is in the waters, it's in the air that we breathe. It's just that Bible canon. Those books are there. When we talk to people, we all know what we're talking about. Well, rarely do we actually think about how or what, well, how we got the Bible and where do those letters come from. Sometimes we'll talk about the context about when they're written or whatnot, but why did we choose those specific letters, those books, and those deals in this area? Well, that's really what I want to talk about today a little bit. At least introduce the subject. It's a very complex subject. As you guys know from Fractured Faith, a lot of these subjects you can spend hours and hours, and people has written PhD theses and books, and they spend their whole lives studying one of these issues. But the goal is to introduce you to just a little bit of tidbits about theology and about life and about what that means for us as Jesus followers, in 2025. And then for those of us who have actually had to unpack or change some of our beliefs and areas, it's helpful to know that we're not alone, that there's other, believers in this umbrella or this big kind of camp called the ecclesia, the church that follows Jesus. And it's a lot bigger than just our American evangelicalism that we tend to come with. And it's okay that we can still be able to follow Jesus, even if we come to different conclusions or even different practices and different beliefs than maybe the church that we grew up in, or maybe our parents or whatnot. It's like, it's okay because Jesus is much, much, much bigger than what we tend to think about. And sometimes we put them in our own little boxes, right? And so the Bible is one of those kind of areas I want to kind of explore. And quite frankly, it's just fascinating. I think it is such fascinating to me. And yeah, so we're going to kind of get into that a little bit and talk a little bit about the Bible and where it came to be. So to start off with, I'm going to start off by kind of blowing and saying there's actually 12 different Christian Bible canons. That's right. So there's at least 12 that I know of. There's probably more, but there's at least 12 different Christian groups or 12 different Bibles in the Christian church. Now, when I'm talking about, actually, before I even talk about what those 12 are, I want to define what does it mean to be a Christian, right? And I think we actually, Angel and I had a whole kind of podcast out near the beginning of what's considered Christian. And I would define Christian as followers of Jesus of Nazareth, and really by the Nicene Creed. Okay, the Nicene Creed was this really amazing creed. In 325, they modified it in 381 at the Council of not Constantinople, yeah, because it's Constantinople Nicene Creed. And they kind of added to a little bit, but 325 really was kind of that Nicaic is the main structure of the creed. And that creed really was set to define who was Jesus. Was he fully God? Was he fully human? Was he a human that was just kind of empowered by God to be able to do it? Was he a human that just was very good and just kind of did some pretty good stuff? Did the baptism then make him? Was he fully divine? And he just appeared to be a human, but he really wasn't human. He actually was fully divine. Those are all kind of questions that the early church fathers and the mothers had. And for about 300 years, they wrestled back and forth. And then, of course, who was the Holy Spirit? How did the Holy Spirit play into this? What role did the Trinity had? Like, what was the Trinity? Because you're not going to find the word Trinity actually in the scriptures. It kind of came in at a later date, theology and contextualizing what the message was. So all those things wrestling around in there kind of comes in about 325, like, hey, this thing called Christianity, this is what we're going to put our phraseology around that and say that this is what Christianity is. So that became the foundation of what it was for this last several thousand years or so. I think it's been 1800 years now that come into it about, hey, this is what the creeds are, or this is what it is. And when we talk about Christianity, that's really what I'm talking about, that Nicene Continental Creed that really kind of defined what it was. Now, that there was some splinter groups a little bit before then, but for the most part, that's where I'm going to get, because most of the big heresies about, was Jesus human, was he God, or Holy Spirit, all that was hammered out in that first 300 years. Okay. So within that, if I kind of say, okay, this is the umbrella that I'm talking about, Christianity, following Jesus, and this is really what I'm talking about, like who Jesus is, I'm talking about. There's 12 different my words skipping here, canons, Bible canons that are accepted by it, right? And they really kind of fall under four different buckets, right? So you have the Western tradition. The Western tradition, which is comprised of Latin Catholicism or Roman Catholicism, which is by far the oldest in the Western tradition. You have the Anglican Church, the Protestant, mainly kind of, you have a lot of the more evangelical Protestants, and then you have Luther's 1534 canon, which a lot of the Reformed or kind of Lutheran canons will kind of follow in a little bit, and they have a little bit of a different section into their canon as well. So you got those four kind of major buckets, and we'll talk about the differences here in a minute, but those are the kind of four buckets under Western tradition. Then you have the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and the Eastern Orthodox tradition is the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, and the Gregorian Orthodox. Those three are the three major kind of streams within Eastern Orthodox. There's division, smaller ones, but when we talk about Biblical Canon, the Greek, the Russian, and the Georgian actually have those are the three big ones with some slight variations of their what's in their Bible as well. Then you have the Oriental Orthodox. The Oriental Orthodox are ones that we don't typically talk a lot about here in America. I don't know as much about them. I would love to learn, I would love to learn a lot more, but we don't really have a lot in English written about them. But you got the Armenian Church, you have the Orthodox Tehoidi Church, and the Coptic Orthodox, which is, of course, in Egypt, in the Syriac Orthodox Church. And those are four different traditions within the Oriental Orthodox grouping. And again, kind of the Middle East, the Arabic kind of world, and often towards India. And they have their own canons. And then you actually have the Church of the East, which is also kind of in that same Iran, Iraq kind of area that came in there. And they have their own kind of set structure of their Bible as well. So 12 different traditions, all of which would hold to the Nicene Creed as being, hey, this is who Jesus is, this is who the faith is, but they all have slightly different books in their Bible to look at. And by far and large, all of those books that they really kind of struggle with fall in on what we would call the Old Testament. Okay, so it's the variations of the Old Testament within it. All those groups will take the New Testament and say, yep, we like the New Testament. The books that we have in there are Paul, the writings, the Gospels. Yep, we're all there. Now, some of them will actually differ on, who wrote what, because we do know that some of the letters of Paul are a little bit, they're not quite sure if it was Paul that was writing them, or even you get into like first and second, third John. We don't know if it really was John, the Apostle John, as tradition says. What was he really writing second, third John? Is the author of Revelation the same John who wrote the Gospel of John? And so they'll differ a little bit on authorship and on when historically those letters were written, but they will hold to those letters that's in the New Testament, right? So they'll hold to that, which gives me, quite frankly, a lot of hope and faith, because as a follower of Jesus, it really is the New Testament that's dear to my heart. This is, Jesus. This is the church's response to Jesus coming down, the incarnate Christ, the incarnate God who came down and actually set the stage and lived life and showed its way forward, died for our sins and the whole 9 yards. It has really kind of set in that New Testament canon. And so it's really, really cool to me, I think, that if you look about all these traditions within Christianity, we all say, yep, we love that New Testament. We love us some Paul's. We love us some Gospels. We love us some John's writings, some James and Jude. Yep, we're down with that, right? There really isn't any big questions about that. Now, there are some other books that were written around that they didn't make the canon, but we all agree on that canon. The Old Testament is really where things get a little bit more dicey, and I think get a little bit more dicey for a lot of different reasons. Some of it political and cultural, and like which just kind of language or culture did you want to go with. They really kind of determined a lot of what it is. And there's some extra books that was kind of written around there that they are kind of take a look at, and they come from Judaism, because, Old Testament with the Hebrew Bible. And, surprise, surprise, Judaism was not a unified group. They actually had several different groups within Judaism. And we have at least two different Hebrew Bibles. So you had the Samaritan Pentateuch, and you had, the other Torah. You had the Septuagint, which is a kind of another Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And so they had some different Bibles at play during the first, second, third century AD that Christianity was developing. And so depending upon where your emphasis were and your ethnic breakdown as a church, you will kind of decide, what these verses or which books you kind of went into. And I want to get into that here a little bit more with some more details on what that looks like. But that's really where it comes into play. Now, before I go into details, I want to take a pause for a moment, because when we're talking about development of Bible canon and what books of the Bibles are put in there, a lot of people get really nervous because they're like, hey, we want the Bible to be, fully inspired and fully inherent and all this. And we put a lot of emphasis on the written word and how it was. And there is something to be said about that. Don't get me wrong, man. I love me the Bible. I read the Bible. I look at it. I study the Bible. And I think we need it. I need the Bible, right? And how we read it is a whole nother subject. We can spend another podcast or a couple podcasts talking about how do we read the Bible. But the Bible is definitely something to be done. And the faith of God has been set down with us through our Hebrew sisters and brothers that they became into Christianity and kind of stayed. It's fascinating to me that God chose these people, the people of Israel, of Abraham, in an area that had a written language to record some of the stuff. In fact, my one of my middle son was asking me questions about that, about the Bible and about what does it mean to be a Cherokee follower of Jesus. And one of the things I mentioned is, well, if God decided to come down as a Cherokee, it'd be a little harder to communicate because we didn't have a written language, 2,000 years ago. We just didn't. And so it'd be a little bit harder to keep those stories fully there and going. And I think we could have. We've had stories forever, but it has its own challenges when you don't actually have it written down. But instead, he actually came in the Roman Empire and as a Hebrew with a long history of writing things down, which I think is really cool because we were able to preserve a lot of these stories. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Bible, the Old Testament, was written in Hebrew and in Aramaic. So you have Daniel was written in Aramaic, some parts I think it was Isaiah. I think it wasn't Aramaic. That wasn't maybe it wasn't Isaiah, but I know Daniel definitely was more Aramaic as well as the Hebrew that's written. And then it was translated into Greek. And then from Greek, the Bible has been translated into Latin and into a lot of other languages. That's very, very key because when you think of like Islam, for example, of where their Allah has the Quran, and the Quran is to be talked about or read only really in Arabic. And Arabic was a language that was spread around and say, hey, it's only there because that's what the Quran was. Christianity or even Hebrew never really had that restriction on it. Hebrew was definitely the language that they spoke, but there was never quite the lockdown thing that, hey, this has to be this language. It can be that the scriptures can be translated into Greek. They can be translated in Latin into English, into Cherokee, into Spanish, and that's fine. And it doesn't lose its potency, so to speak. The message still continues in that contextualization and that translation, which is pretty exciting, I think, from that area. The other thing to keep in mind with the talk about the Bible being developed is this is just factual information. This is not talking about anything about the theology, about what it teaches me or doesn't teach me, or about what was happening. These books of the Bible that were collected have been for centuries, again, for Christianity for 2,000 years. And then before that, within the Hebrew faith, they've been keeping these books, and they're saying it's the community of the believers that these are worth keeping. These are writings that we see something in God of these, that we want to keep these and hold these tight, and we want to read them and pay attention to them. And that's so important because when we, as a modern day followers of Jesus, we have to remember that we're not the first people to have questions. In fact, most of the questions that we have about the faith have been answered before by our forefathers and our foremothers, and that we just got to go and listen to them and talk to them. And that's where that tradition comes in very powerful. Now, it's not to be verbatim. So we don't just take what our church mothers said and just go run with it. It's they were speaking to their time and place. The Bibles were talking about their context. Context is so key in everything. But we can recognize that we have a long tradition of people, Jesus followers, and we read the Bible. This is a record of what God was doing and working in and through His people. There's other records in other places, and a record of within nature, within our lives, within everything else, other verses and Bibles and things that be kind of inspired. But there's something very, very important about the canon that we come into within our tradition. Which is why we're talking about it, because it is important. So keep that in mind is like I talk about these are the factual information. I'm not drawing, or my hope and my goal is not to draw doubt or anything about all these books or the content thereof. I'm just simply sharing with all of us is that, hey, within Christianity, there's all these 12 different versions of the Old Testament, and there's some good reasons and some crazies, and wherever you may find yourself in kind of that deal, okay. But we all agree on the New Testament, which is again phenomenally cool. So, all right, let's with that kind of disclaimer, I know I'm talking around a little bit. Let's kind of get into more details. So, within the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, you really have three different sections. You have the Pentateuch, right? The Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, is that's literally what Pentateuch means, or the Torah. The instructions. It is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. It's those first 5. Now, those first 5 were kind of locked in place around about the 5th century BCE. That's about 500 years before Jesus shows up on the picture. Those kind of books, like, hey, these are it. Like, boom, these are Moses's. We're going to lock them down. These are amazing. We're reading these, and you can see that influences of all 5 of those throughout all of the rest of everything, because they are really the most oldest, and they're like just locked down as far as these are it. These are it. Okay. Now, outside of that, you actually have a bunch of kind of historical books, also called the prophets, is where they kind of come into it. So the prophets are you're like you get into Isaiah and Jeremiah and some of those different ones coming in that area. And in the prophets and some of those, that was about third century BCE. So it's about 300 or so, 400, BCE. Again, that third century, and they were the next one that kind of been locked in place with that one. And then the last part was the Psalms, the Proverbs, and the writings of the kind of the Old Testament. And they were, well, they were there's a lot more, I guess, debate about when they came about, quite frankly, because some of them were in development for quite a while. But usually they're somewhere around the second century BCE, all the way up into about the second century post Jesus, so about second century CE. And again, that would have been the 11 books of kind of the writings within that one there. So some of the writings you are talking about Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, Daniel, Song of Solomon's, Proverbs, some of those things, right? So those are really where the canon closes. Now, when I say the canon closes, that doesn't mean that the books were written at that time. Don't get me wrong. We're not talking about when the letters are written. We're talking about when they were saying, hey, this is a group that we're going to say that we want these books to stay, or they're special. They're special to us. In fact, I would say the book of Job is actually one of the probably one of the oldest book historically, but it was also one of the later books as part of the writings. It was one of the later books to be accepted as part of the Bible, where it's like the books of the Torah, which really were again Judaism. But hey, we're people of Moses and Abraham. We're going to lock those in there earlier on. So, over the course between the 5th century BCE all the way into about the 2nd century CE, which is about 200 years after Jesus, around in there is when the Bible really, the Hebrew Bible, kind of locked into place and really kind of said, hey, this is where we're going to go from it. Okay. Now, with that in mind, you actually have three kind of historical versions of the Hebrew Bible that is usually used a lot. So the Septuagint is this is about late third century BCE, coming into about 130 or so BCE. So you're about 100 years or so, 150 years before Jesus. The Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, which included most of what we can have in the letters and the prophets and the writings. And that time, Alexander the Great had conquered over pretty much all of the Mediterranean area, all of Israel and Egypt, and all this area was kind of conquered, and Hebrew language was actually dying out. Greek became the dominant religion or language of the Hebrew people. The Hebrew people were scattered across the Greek Empire, and they're actually, Alexander the Great's kingdom has split up, and you had different generals. So you had the different ones. They were fighting each other, different places, but Greek was still that primary language of that kind of the east side of the Mediterranean at the time. And so the bunch of Jewish leaders, especially around the Alexandria, Egypt area, got together, and there were 70 of them, according to tradition, and they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And so that's where you get the Septuagint as being the area coming in. Now, with that said, with the area of the Septuagint really became the primary Bible of Jesus and the New Testament and of pretty much the Christianity, quite frankly, all the way coming into it. And when you actually see quotes by Paul or by the apostles in the New Testament, they're actually quoting from the Greek Septuagint, rather than the Hebrew. This is why, for example, I don't know if maybe I'm a little bit nerd, but you see Jesus kind of quoting Isaiah 61. He said, hey, I've come to, preach good news to the poor, to cast out demons. Well, if you go and look in Isaiah, in your English Bibles, the English in the Isaiah is going to be a little bit different than the English in the Gospels. And the reason for that is because our modern English translations are usually based upon what's called the Masoretic text, which I'll get to in a minute, which is not the same Greek or the same background as what the gospel writers were quoting. They were quoting the Greek Septuagint. So if you actually get English translation that says Septuagint, you're going to get the same kind of translations both in Isaiah as you do in the Gospels. So kind of a tidbit there. And most likely, again, this the Septuagint would have been what Jesus was reading and quoting, and that really was again this like late third century, 130 BCE. That was kind of the predominant Hebrew Bible, or not Hebrew, Jewish Bible that was both people was using. Okay, so kind of hold on to that one. Throwing a lot of stuff out here, but it's I don't know. To me, it's fascinating. Hopefully, y'all are enjoying this. So the Messianic text, this was a Messianic where groups of Jewish scribes and scholars who were working kind of in around Jewish centers, 5th century to about 10th century CE. So we're talking about 5th century. That would have been like your 400s, right? The 400s coming all the way into, 1,000. So 500 to 1,000 years after Christ. And they actually started pulling everything together, and they pulled the Hebrew and Aramaic text together, and they brought together these 24 books in what's called the Hebrew Bible. And really around about 300 to 500 CE. Okay, that's really come into it. And the oldest complete copy of the Messianic text we have, which includes all of the Old Testament, was in about 1,000 CE. Now, this was Hebrew. All this was in Hebrew. Okay. So all this was in Hebrew and everything else. And most of our English translations are based upon this Hebrew Messianic text rather than the Greek Septuagint. There's many reasons for that. One of the big readings is that as Protestant American kind of modern scholars, they think there's a tendency to emphasize Hebrew because Hebrew would have been the kind of the original language of the Jewish people, and they kind of have a tendency to think that, hey, we think that Hebrew that was written originally was probably more to what God was saying than, say, the Greek Septuagint, which we know was a translation of the Hebrew. And so since Hebrew was first, we need to get to the Hebrew. The problem is we don't have any old Hebrew texts. So Septuagint is actually older as a document than the Hebrew Messianic text. We have some fragments here and there, but we really don't have the full, Bible as it is in Hebrew. Older than going back into the BC. All of our Hebrew Bibles are actually in the AD kind of or CE kind of area as a way. So it's a kind of a interesting area on that one. We do know that when St. Jerome translated the Bible from Greek, from the Greek New Testament and stuff into Latin and Latin Vulgate, he actually used some of the Messianic texts as well as some of the Greek. And so there were some places on that. We also know that the Hebrew people actually really latched on to the Messianic text, the Hebrew text, as really their text when they split from Christianity. Because after that split from Christianity, really took the Septuagint as the founding document for them. In fact, you still see the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox canons are really based upon the Greek Septuagint, while the Western traditions tend to be off of the Hebrew Messianic. And so there's kind of a division there, which is also why you get some different books in there. Now, there's a third Old Testament that we need to be paying attention to, and that's the Samaritan Pentateuch. And this is a Samaritan group that was there, kind of a branch off of Judaism. And you hear about the Samaritans in time of Jesus. And of course, they were there when they were kind of northern kingdom that got taken over by Syria and got left there. And they survived. They're still Samaritans to this day over in the Israel places and over in Jordan and Syria. They're still kicking on, doing their thing, and they have their own kind of Pentateuch that they actually have in kind of their language, which is kind of I think it's more Aramaic, whatnot, but they have a little bit of a different version of things than some of the other ones, some places, so the kind of areas. Now, when we're talking about these. All right, so let me go back up. So let me kind of reface. So that's the Hebrew document up there, right? And so within these areas, the Septuagint and the Hebrew, some of them would actually have some different books about the intertestament time, which is between Malachi and Matthew. And this is where you really get the book of Tobit, the book of Judith, First and Second Maccabees, the book of Wisdom, Brock. Some of these different things come into play. These are books that really kind of explain what was happening, what was God doing between Malachi and Matthew. Because, oh, I don't want to ever hear it again, but I hear pastors all the time talk about in their churches, like, hey, there was a 400-year of silence in the Bible between Malachi and Matthew. And then when Matthew, John the Baptist shows up, I'm like, no, 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 no. God was not silent in those 400. God continued to work in those 400 years. And we have a record of it. It's called the Maccabees. It's First and Second Maccabees. It's like we have it. We can read it. Just because you're not reading it doesn't mean that God was silent. We still have all those writings and we can still look them up, right? And those are books that were in the Septuagint. And so a lot of times they got put into our Bibles. And a lot of our churches today really are on what do we do with these books? What do we do with the Maccabees? What do we do with Second Ezra? Or what do we do with, Enoch? Or what do we do with some of those ones? So those are really the areas that we're really talking about. Some of these canons are kind of shifting. Or it could be, for example, what do we do with Psalms 152, 155, which is there's a couple of Psalms that some people don't include and some people do. And there are parts of Isaiah that some groups take and some groups don't, right? So those are those places where those 12 canons come into play. And really, do we follow that Septuagint and what was in the Septuagint? Do we follow what was in the Masoretic text that was later in Hebrew? And like, which ones do we follow? What do we do with those different kind of interdeuteranomical kind of books? And that's where that 12 comes into play. Because remember, everybody likes the New Testament. That's cool. It's really the Old Testament they had the questions about. All right. Clear as mud. Hopefully you guys are tracking with me a little bit. I want to pick that up a minute, but I want to kind of a little bit about where we get our New Testament letters from, because even in the New Testament, just like the Old Testament, where they were kind of fighting, or not really fighting, but having debates about which ones do we think are more important than others, the New Testament went through their own series as well, right? So there was a lot of times in the first 100 years, 200 years, you had Paul writing and he's saying this thing. You have Peter saying this, John saying this, Matthew's up here going here, Luke is going over here. All these people are writing different letters in different places. Diaca, it's coming out, the Shepherd of Hermes is coming out. These are different ones. And different church fathers would say, hey, we like this list. No, we want this list and we want this list. And it really wasn't until about 393, this would have been the kind of a Dicaean Council of Hippo, and then in 397 at this group of Carthage, that the church kind of said, yeah, we're going to kind of come down and we're going to lock it down to these kind of books of the Bible, the New Testament. Yep, this is where we got, right? And they include the ones we have. Revelation almost didn't make it in. It was really the last one to be kind of considered in. The Shepherd of Hermes almost made it in, but was ultimately kicked out. So there's some different ones like that, but about that one. So to put it in perspective, that's, you're talking about 350 years after these books are written, after Jesus, I guess just say, after Jesus, before the church says, you know what, these are the ones we want. Right now, this was the same people who in 325 were saying, hey, this is what the Constantine Creed is. This is the creed. This is what's been set down by the apostles and by Jesus. This is the teaching that we're going to follow. We're going to lock down in the Council of Nicaea. Boom, here we go, right? And then probably about another 75 years after that, it's when they say, yeah, we're going to actually lock in these letters as being what we want, right? So a lot of the same people who actually made the decision later were actually, as young men and women, they were actually at that council. Okay, and some people had longer lives, some were not, but this around those church fathers in an area that really kind of set the tone, which is why that 4th century is so important, because so much happened in that point. And yes, Constantine came in there and his grandkids said, no, he did not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That was just like his great-great-grandkid, like later on, like in 390 or something later on. He actually legalized Christianity so they could pay taxes and stuff. That's another tangent I get on to of that one. But all to say is that the Bible, we start to see it really becomes about the end of that fourth century, started becoming coalescing into boom, here we go. And that's around the time that you had Jerome came in the early 400s, and he actually translated into the Vulgate, which became that big kind of Latin text that the Western tradition then started following, where the Eastern tradition still kept the Septuagint as their big one. Now, part of what Jerome did is he actually moved some of the interdominant books, that Maccabees and stuff like that. They, in the Septuagint, you have the Hebrew scriptures, and then you have those the like the Torah and the prophets and the writings, and then you had those Maccabees and intertestament period right after that, and then you had the Gospels, and so it kind of followed in chronological order. Jerome kind of moved a bunch of stuff to the back a little bit, and he kind of changed the order up a little bit, which had some influence later on Luther and some of the reformers later on in life, because they really kind of had that, where Luther, and he translated into Greek, he took that Tobit and Judith and the first and second Maccabees, he put them on the back, and he actually separated and put, hey, these are the Apocrypha. These are something separate from it, and really kind of had this deal of saying, like, these are worth reading. They're not on the same level as we say the what we would call the scriptures, we New Testament, and then the rest of what we now have the Old Testament. But the Apocrypha is good to read. But it was still in the Bible. It was still bound in the same book within the same cover, right? When they started, because again, you talk about the 1500s, they actually had what we call books, right? Instead, prior to that, they had scrolls. And so you go to the scroll cabinet, you grab the scrolls down and read it. But then now they're binding them up there because you actually had the printing press, and they're putting all these in a cover. And he's including those in there to be able to say, hey, we want to actually have all these books in places, right? And so then that's when you actually, as a response to some of that, by the way, you had the Roman Catholics, the Council of Trent. This was on April 8th, 1546. Actually took up the question of Bible canon, because up until then, they still had those interdimensional kind of books, right? They were always there. Like Jerome had them in there, the Septuagint. Well, they never actually officially voted as a full church council to say that, hey, we want this one. I mentioned up in Hippo and at the end of the fourth century in the 393 or so. Well, when those kind of happened, that wasn't a full church council. That was a part of the church that said, yeah, we're going to take these. And then the rest of the church said, yeah, sounds good to us. We like what you said. We're going to go there. But they never had a full church council like the Council of Nicaea to lock the Bible down until 1546. And that's when the Roman Catholic Church said, yep, we're going to lock the canon. It's never going to change. It's going to be these books. We're going to include these Maccabees in our book, but we're going to lock it down. The Orthodox Church around that same time actually did a similar thing, and they actually kind of locked stuff down on their point. So it's actually interesting was the biblical canon really wasn't even set for 1,500 years. So even though it took about 400 years, 350 to 400 years for the letters to really be able to say, hey, we think these 27 are great. No, for New Testament, no one really locked down the Old and New and inner Deuteronomical books until the 1500s. So it really took about 1,550 or so years to be able to really set the Christian canon of saying this is what we think a Bible is. Up until then, there was still some wiggle room and some doubt which one's coming in there. So it's relatively new. It's 500 years old, folks. That's it. The Bible that we have is about 500 years old in the form that we have it. The letters have been around for a while, but is that the way that we have it? It's only about that 500 years old. Actually, a little less for English translator, but okay, again, did I tell you this was complicated? This is why we typically just skip over and say, just read it, right? We just trust the publishers that the book, we pull it off the shelf and we read it. But man, frankly, if we really think this Bible is what, God's revelation to us, we should know how it showed up. It just didn't pop out of the air and beam down from heaven. It has a history, right? And we should know it, history. So hopefully you're fascinated like I am. But so, all right. So we're in Protestant Reformation, 1500s. The Roman Catholics lock theirs down. The East Orthodox tradition locks theirs down. Finally, they actually have the Hebrew one. So again, we got the Torah. The Torah is all. Everybody has Torah. Everybody has all five of them. Pretty much everybody has Joshua and Judges and Ruth and First and Second Kings and Chronicles. They may call them kingdoms and versus kings and stuff like that. But in fact, you actually see some of them like First and Second Samuel. That's very English, and a lot of your Latin or Orthodox is First and Second Kingdom, and then Third and Fourth Kingdom, which is our English First and Second Kings. So they name a little bit different, but the same books. But around the 1500s, that's when the Catholics and Orthodox and some of the Orientals say, you know what, we're going to take the Maccabees and Tobit and Jethro and some of those, and we're going to make those part of our canon. We're going to lock those in and say, yep, we're going to keep these. These are part of the scriptures. Full stop. Boom. There they are. Okay. Now, the Protestants, they don't follow that, right? They already have a little bit of a problem with a lot of the Roman Catholics over in Europe anyway. So they don't do it. So what they do is they kind of follow Luther's deal, and they kind of keep the Apocrypha off on the side. They keep it bound in the book, but they keep saying, hey, we kind of want to keep this one, but we're not going to do it. In fact, you even get into the wet mess and confection of faith in 1647, and some of the other ones saying, you know what, both testaments are true to the word of God, but we're not going to take the Apocrypha. Okay, so they set that up in the kind of the late 1500s, early 1600s. The Protestant churches, the Reformed churches of John Calvin, Martin Luther, all those guys say, you know what? We are taking these books here as scriptures. We're going to keep the Apocrypha. They're really good, but we're just not going to have them at the layer of scriptures. All right, boom. All right, that's how we kind of get our books that we have today. Only not quite, because you see, even though in the 1500s and 1600s they say they don't want to take the Apocrypha as being a canon and saying the same level, they did include it in their Bible translations. In fact, it wasn't really until about the 1800s that they stopped doing it. So the King James Bible, for example, the King James Bible would actually include the Apocrypha. It was there. They actually had it. You could open it up and you have Genesis and Malachi and First and Second Maccabees and Tobit. All of them were there. Now they had them on the side. They had a different label to them saying, hey, this is the Apocrypha, but they were there. But in 1823, the National Bible Society of Scotland actually petitioned the Bible and Foreign Bible Society not to print the Apocrypha, which actually resulted in a decision not to use any of the Bible Society funds to pay for printing any Bibles with the Apocrypha. Okay? So this really was where it came down to a money issue, because they even said it's cheaper to print the Bible without the Apocrypha in it, which, to be fair, is true, because the Apocrypha takes up a certain percentage of paper and ink and such. And if you're not printing it, it's cheaper. And if it's not really scriptures, then, why are you printing it, right? So they basically, in about 1826, 1830, they just they cut. And they're like, all right, we're done. We're not going to do it. We're going to now print, again, in English. It would be in the King James Bible. We're just going to print it. And it's just going to be the Old Testament, New Testament as we know. We're not going to do the Maccabees, the Tobit, the Jethro. We're not going to do any of those. We're just going to do these other ones. So then that's where, for the next 100 years, it was just that on there. And then in about 1964, the American Bible Society lifted the restrictions on the publications of the Apocrypha, with the British and Foreign Bible Society following in 1966. So then you start seeing some more Bibles coming out. In fact, you still see the some of the Reformed Protestants, like Lutheran churches, the Anglican churches, they would still actually, they never really followed through on this Bible Society ban, but they kind of held that they still published it and made Bibles with the Apocrypha in the back, separate from the Old and New Testament, but they still included it. But after 1964, 1966, you start seeing a lot more of the King James Bible and some other ones being published with the Apocrypha in it in that area. So it's a little bit more common today. However, it's still not most of your Bibles. If you go to your NIVs or your ESVs or your Net Bible, New English translations, your Living Bible, your Message, they're just giving you the Hebrew Old Testament and the New Testament, and they're not including the Maccabees or Tobit or those places. So that's where it comes into play. But if you go to an Anglican or more of a mainline Protestant church and go in their Bibles or when their study Bibles or a Roman Catholic Bible or a Greek Orthodox Bible or Oriental Orthodox Bible, you will find other books in the Bible. And so if you are one of those people who are shifting your faith and you've actually went, I don't know, like maybe you shifted from a Baptist church into a Greek Orthodox church, or you went to a Roman Catholic church, you went Anglican, you may be surprised that when you open up their Bible, there's some other different things in there that maybe you weren't familiar with. Well, I'm here to be able to tell you that they're worth reading. I definitely think they're worth reading. In fact, I would say that the Maccabees, everyone should read the Maccabees. The Maccabees are a fascinating read. First and Second Maccabees, they really kind of share a lot of more what's happening. Why Rome's on there? Like, why is the nation of Israel under Roman Empire? What's happening with Jesus? What's happening with Paul? Why is circumcision such a big deal? Why is the Lord's Day, the Sabbath, such a big day? Why is everybody mad at Jesus for healing on the Sabbath? Like, what's going on? Well, that's all explained in the Maccabees, and there are definitely some very good values for that in that one. I would definitely kind of follow in more of probably more the kind of the Protestant tradition right now, where I think the kind of the mainline Protestant churches, Anglican churches would say that the Apocrypha is worth reading. I don't hold it at the same level of canon as I would say the Old Testament and New Testament. I think those books, as I still have sunshine in my hooks there. I just can't get away from them. But I still think they're worth reading. I think they're still worth taking into account. I have actually have a Greek Orthodox Study Bible, which is actually using the Septuagint, so the English translation of the Septuagint, and that to me breathes some new fresh air into the Old Testament. There's a little bit of a different calibration there because the Jewish scribes that were actually translating it into Greek, there were some changes, there were some shifts where they kind of say, you know what, we're going to kind of emphasize this portion of character of God rather than some of the others. And I think it's a little less wrathfully. I think the Hebrew's a little bit more meaner God in some ways. I might get in trouble saying that, but there's just some passages in there that they got tampered into Septuagint a little bit. But they're both gods. They're both good. They're both great. I think the Bible is phenomenal. Again, read it, study it, passionate, but also know that there are Jesus followers that really are having some bigger, wider views of the scriptures. Now, I will make a caution that there are some Bible books, especially that should not be considered part of the Bible canon. And that's when you get into what called the Gnostic Gospels. And it's like the Gospel of Judas, the birth narratives of James. And there's some of these that are written around the first and second, third century. And they really radically change the character who Jesus is. And this is where you get Dan Brown and some of his writings of the Holy Grail or some of those kind of conspiracy deals. It has been in very vogue recently because a lot of these Gnostics kind of deals, Gnosticism being secret knowledge. And some of these books showed up in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they kind of been giving a new life the last 30, 20 years. And so you see a lot of people saying, well, these were kicked out by, Constantine. I've seen people say that, well, Constantine kicked these out of the church and these weren't there. And I'm like, okay, no. Like, there's a reason why the church got rid of those. And some of them, again, is you have Jesus as a 12-year-old kid making a clay pigeon come to life, and then, striking down his teacher and like killing his teacher because the teacher, criticized him at wood class or something like that. And there's some strange things that really did change the character of Jesus. And those Gnosticism, pretty much all of the major Nicene Constantinople Creed Christians all look at that and say, yeah, no, time out. This is not it. The 12 canons I talked about really are dealing with those intertestamental books. What do we do with these Hebrew books that were kind of written about the time between Malachi and Jesus, 400 years? What do we do with those books? That's the question at hand, not so much the other. The other big takeaway I would actually kind of say with this one is realizing the Bible canon is when we talk about the creeds. And as a kid, I was never a credo Christian. I didn't know the creeds. It wasn't really talked about. But the creeds, I think that the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, these are really statements of faith that really locks us down to who Christianity, who was Jesus, who was God the Father, who was the Holy Spirit, and they actually predate what we have as the Bible. They were accepted by people and believers, and locked down and saying, "Hey, we as a community say this is what we are." And they actually made that decision before they made a decision of the books of the Bible. And I think that's important because sometimes we tend to put so much emphasis on the written Bible that we forget the traditions of our forefathers, and realizing that we need to be paying attention to what the church council said. We need to be paying attention to the traditions and the words we came through. That this isn't just about what was happening on one in the modern era. Is we actually Christianity is way older and way more mysterious and way bigger than we sometimes give it credit for. And so if you are shifting in your faith, you are rethinking, hey, God is there, man. God is real. Hang on to Jesus. Read your Bible. Maybe pick up a different Bible. We'll get in translations maybe another time. But anyway, there you go, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this kind of overview of the biblical canon and some of the developments thereof. I try to hit some highlights to you. Oh, there's a lot more nuance in there that even I know, but hope you had a fascinating time. Make sure that you follow, like and follow the videos in the stream on YouTube, on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That really definitely helps, and let me know that you guys are listening out there and watching out there. Hope you're enjoying it. Make some comments, let me know, and stay tuned until next time. Donadaka ai, and until I see y'all again.